Morning, everybody, on this absolutely gorgeous day in Ottawa. If it were like this all year round, it would have a population of 10 million. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 24 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, as you all know, pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. You know that you have a choice of the floor, English or French translation that you can control. Today, pursuant to Standing Order 108(2) and the motions adopted by the committee on Thursday, February 17th, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of the rise of ideologically motivated violent extremism in Canada. With us today from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, Marie-Hélène Chaillet, Executive Director, Integrated Terrorism Assessment Centre, and Sherry Henderson, Assistant Director, Requirements. From the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Robert Burley, Senior Director, Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence, and Leslie Soper, Director General, National Security Policy. And finally, in this section, from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Deputy Commander Michael Duhem. So, welcome to everybody. There will be 5-minute opening statements from each of our guests or combinations of our guests. And I would now invite Ms. Marie-Hélène Chaillet to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, membres du comité.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee. As mentioned, I am Marie-Hélène Chaillet, Executive Director of the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Centre. The Integrated Terrorism Assessment Centre's mandate is to analyze terrorism-related intelligence collected by various organizations.
Analyze a threat posed by ideologically motivated violent extremism, or IMV, which, as you know, is complex, fluid, and has been evolving over the years. As you have heard in previous testimonies during your studies, many of the ideologically motivated extremists who produce and disseminate violent, threatening rhetoric do not actually intend to carry out physical attacks themselves. However, they may sway, and actually have swayed, other individuals to mobilize and conduct acts of serious violence. These individuals, who may be susceptible to IMV narrative because of their personal grievances or extremist beliefs, may not belong to known groups or associations. They can galvanize around a number of issues, including public health measures, authority, or gender-related concerns. And as such, IMV attacks conducted by lone actors are quite difficult to predict. They do not necessarily require a lot of planning, coordination, or capabilities, and they can be directed at various targets depending on the perpetrator's specific grievances and extremist views. Such targets could include government facilities, healthcare workers, politicians, women. D'une part, le climat d'incertitude.
The sense of uncertainty generated by the pandemic and by conspiracy theories provide fertile ground for ideological extremism. Furthermore, the relative normalization of using violent threats to express disagreement, in addition to the spread of disinformation, undermines social resilience. All of this contributes to favorable conditions for actors to mobilize to violence. I'll stop here and would be happy to answer your questions. I'll give the floor to my colleague, Sherry Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Chaillet, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand the committee has voted to include the remarks Tim Hallwig, my predecessor, delivered to you last year on the same topic. Since I'm sharing my time with the ITAC's Executive Director, I'll do my best to be succinct. Let me begin by saying that the threat ideologically motivated violent extremism, or IMVE, poses remains a high priority for CSIS. Le mandat du SECU
CSIS's mandate is to investigate threats to Canada's security, advise government on these threats, and take measures to mitigate them.
It is not illegal to be hateful, racist, or misogynist. Freedom of speech is constitutionally protected, and while the internet is filled with bigoted and misogynistic language and narratives, much of it falls under the category of awful but lawful. As we explain in our annual public report released last week, IMVE is a complex and constantly evolving threat, and Canada is not immune to its impacts. That is why we have been dedicating increased resources to investigate and counter this threat. In total, there have been 7 attacks and 3 disrupted plots in the Canadian IMVE space since 2014. These attacks have killed 26 people and wounded 40 others on Canadian soil, more than any other form. Most recently, in June 2021, an attack in London, Ontario, killed 4 individuals and seriously injured another. In October 2021, a former Canadian Armed Forces reservist was sentenced to 9 years in a U.S. prison for plotting serious violence with members of the Base, a neo-Nazi group that is a listed terrorist entity in Canada. Overall, since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, IMVE activity has been fueled by an increase in extreme anti-authority and anti-government rhetoric, often rooted in the weaponization of conspiracy theories. Dans ce contexte,
In that context, CSIS has observed a marked increase in violent threats to elected officials and government representatives during the past 2 years.
2022 Freedom Convoy, as the Director explained earlier this week to the Special Joint Committee on the Declaration of Emergency, CSIS is specifically prohibited from investigating lawful advocacy, protest, or dissent, except when it is carried on in conjunction with activities that constitute a threat to the security of Canada. CSIS closely monitored for opportunities the protests could have presented to IMVE threat actors to promote or engage in serious acts of violence in Canada. In conclusion, I want to reiterate that the people of CSIS are committed to fulfilling our mandate to protect Canada, working closely with communities and our partners across the country to keep all Canadians safe. With that, I will turn it over to Public Safety. Thank you.
Yes, we will do just that. I will now call upon Mr. Robert Burley or Ms. Leslie Soper to make a statement of up to 5 minutes. Please, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, committee members. My name is Leslie Soper. I am the Director General of National Security Policy at Public Safety Canada. I'm very happy to be here today with my colleagues from both the Public Safety's Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence, Mr. Robert Burley, as well as my colleagues from CSIS and RCMP. The opportunity to speak before this committee on ideologically motivated violent extremism, or IMVE as we call it, is a welcome one. I and my team at Public Safety have been following this study for the last several weeks. We have watched with interest the quality of witnesses that have come forward and offered their views and expertise, and we're pleased to be able to add to it today. By way of context, Public Safety Canada's national security mandate is to coordinate the activities of federal departments and agencies representing the Canadian security and intelligence, or as we refer to it, the S&I community. In this role, it is the responsibility of Public Safety Canada to develop and provide policy advice to the Minister of Public Safety on national security matters in support of the many operational activities undertaken by the S&I community every day in service to Canada. This includes functioning as a centralized hub for coordinating work on a number of national security issues, including cybersecurity, critical infrastructure protection, countering foreign interference, and of course, counterterrorism and ideologically motivated violent extremism. On this last point, I wish to highlight that public safety is also responsible for terrorist listings. It is worth noting that in 2021, Canada added 17 new groups to the criminal code list of terrorist entities, including 6 IMVE groups and 1 individual, raising the total IMVE-specific listings to 9. In fact, just last week, the RCMP charged a suspected member of the international neo-Nazi terrorist network, Atomwaffen Division, in Windsor, Ontario. Atomwaffen Division is one of those 6 groups listed in 2021. With respect to IMVE, in December 2021, the Minister of Public Safety received his mandate letter from the Prime Minister. In that letter, the Minister was instructed to bring forward measures to counter IMVE and strengthen the capacity of police and prosecutors to bring to justice terror suspects to the fullest extent of the law. We in Public Safety Canada, along with others in the S&I community, are actively working to support this commitment now and over the longer term, both internationally as well as domestically. We know that it will require significant effort and it will not be resolved overnight. IMVE is a complex, ever-evolving threat, as this committee is well aware. Internationally, the rise of IMVE is an issue that Canada's closest allies are equally grappling with. For example, countering terrorism and violent extremism in all forms was a key commitment in the roadmap for a renewed US-Canada partnership signed by the Prime Minister and the President of the United States in February of 2021. Countering IMVE is also a growing area of collaboration with our 5 Eyes, our UK, US, Australia, New Zealand, and the G7 partners, and is a subject of other multilateral efforts of which Canada is an active participant. And most notable among these would be the under the Christchurch call to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. I raise this point only to highlight that countering the rise of IMVE is not a uniquely Canadian issue, and that concerted international cooperation and dialogue will continue to be needed to effectively address it. Domestically, we at Public Safety are aware of the need to be open and transparent with Canadians when it comes to making and sustaining progress to counter IMVE here at home. This means, in practice, engagement with civil society, academia, industry, provincial and territorial partners, and others in trying to understand Canadians' expectations of the federal government in this space and to ensure Canada's approach is a whole of society one. I also wish to underline that we recognize it will be highly important to hear from vulnerable and racialized communities and ensure their views and experiences are heard. We are highly attuned to the need for engagement that is respectful and reassures all Canadians of our understanding of IMVE for what it is, which is a serious threat confronted by Canada today. In this vein, it is important to highlight the role of prevention as an essential component of a whole of government and a whole of society response. Prevention is key to countering radicalization.
10 seconds, please.
The Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence is leading efforts in this space, and my colleague Rob Burley is available to answer any questions in relation to that work. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I would call upon Deputy Commissioner Michael Duhem. Sir, you have up to 5 minutes to make an opening statement. Over to you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. It is a beautiful day indeed. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to continue answering questions about IMVE. As a quick refresher, I'm Mike Duhem, Deputy Commissioner, RCMP Federal Policing, which includes the national security portfolio that falls under my responsibility. Over the past months, my team has been following the work being conducted by this committee and commend you for bringing forward such a diverse and knowledgeable list of experts on the subject, as well as the key service providers and industry professionals who need to be part of the solution going forward. Throughout these appearances, you have been given a great deal of information, some of which has no doubt raised concerns about Canada's ability to effectively combat the growing threat around IMVE threat actors. And for the most part, the calls for concern that you have heard are real. We know that IMVE threat environment is rapidly evolving and complex and is increasingly fueled by misinformation and hostile rhetoric surrounding a host of grievances, many of which focus on the government's response to COVID-19 and other matters. This has sown distrust in government institutions, including law enforcement, and has augmented the ability for extremist groups to both recruit new members and increasingly foster hostility. For you and the majority of Canadians, this hostility has manifested itself on the daily news and social media. For many RCMP officers and our fellow law enforcement partners, it has manifested itself in the all too real confrontation, both during Occupation Ottawa and the numerous border crossings blockades. Depuis le début de la pandémie,
Since the beginning of the pandemic, the RCMP has seen a marked increase in the number of IMV occurrences, the majority of which come from threat actors who are not clear group affiliates and who are motivated by highly personalized and nuanced ideologies that lead them to incite or mobilize to violence. During my previous testimony before this committee, I talked about the scale and scope of the problem the RCMP faces. Our appearance today, understand, will focus on what the RCMP is doing about it. Before answering that question, it's important that it be made clear that the federal policing program is one part of the solution. Our enforcement actions are the thin edge of the wedge when it comes to broader government response. The bulk of our collective response needs to be focused on proactive measures, steps that be taken before frustrations can be molded into hate and violence. It's important to remember the RCMP federal policing program is specifically responsible for threats that cross into the national security space laid out in Section 2C of the CSIS Act. Police of jurisdiction maintains responsible for investigating hate-motivated crime, which makes up the vast majority of occurrences. With that said, in the past year, the RCMP has seized this issue and taken concrete steps to get its own house in order. We discuss this with our investigators in the field, in our various national security-focused units, because these are the people who deal with MVE threats on the front lines. We then met with the support teams at national headquarters who assist with providing intelligence information. In both cases, we identified the real-life gaps and challenges that are being faced when we try to identify and take action on potential IMVE and try to prevent people taking action. From that, the RCMP has developed a comprehensive strategy that will seek to address those gaps and challenges over the next 3 years. This will mean revamping everything from the training that our officers receive to reallocating resources to better fit the current picture. It will mean rethinking how we share information with key partners, as well as align federal policing resources to undertake what needs to be done to give our officers the tools they need to address the threat effectively and efficiently.
Approach to dealing with complex problems, the RCMP strategy also focuses on shifting from being largely reactive to being proactive. This will be improving our relationships with key partners in the community and their respective local law enforcement bodies so that we can identify threats before they cross the national security threshold. It will be done by improving information sharing and building up our own intelligence capacity, specifically on the online space. By doing this, we will be in a better position to identify individuals and groups who pose a threat before they are motivated to violence. In addition, the RCMP will continue to use all the tools that it has at its disposal when IMV threats are identified. This would include the use of peace bonds, listing regime, revocation of passports, the use of Secure Air Travel Act, the no-fly list, and other tools that will disrupt the imminent. But make no mistake, as several of the academics have informed this committee, there is no one
10
thing
seconds,
that can be done
please.
to eliminate the IMV threat. Lastly, over the coming months, we will remain ready to support public safety and security partners to develop a broader whole government approach to address the growing threat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I will now open the floor for a round of questioning from members of our committee. And to begin, I will call upon Mr. Lloyd, who will have 6 minutes. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question for Ms. Soper. Are you aware that over 30 churches were burned down in Canada in 2021?
Yes, I am.
And can you answer, is public safety currently investigating the burning of over 30 churches in Canada last year?
Public safety does not have an investigative mandate that might be better directed towards RCMP.
But you said in your testimony that you were given a mandate by this government in 2021 to bring IMVE perpetrators to justice, and now you're saying you don't have a mandate to investigate? Sure.
well, we are not the police of jurisdiction for investigations into IMVE. So I might defer that question to my colleagues on the policing side.
Okay, so if you're not doing an investigation, are you doing anything about the 30 churches that were burned down in 2021?
Again, I can't speak to what the nature of any investigation might be occurring in relation to those horrible events, but I would defer the question to our CMP, who may be police of jurisdiction in relation to some of those.
Thank you.
Burnings.
I'm going to move on to CSIS, Ms. Chair. I have a copy of your 2021 CSIS report, and it lists off a lot of ideologically motivated violent extremist examples, but there's not one example of 30 churches being burned down in Canada last year. Why has that not been included in your CSIS public report?
Thank you very much for the question. However, my organization is the Integrated Threat Assessment Center. I think your question is probably more for my colleague, Mrs. Anderson.
Okay, but are you saying that it's not a threat? That 30 churches were burned down in Canada last year? This isn't under your purview? This isn't a terrorist attack?
So if you allow me to explain just a little bit the mandate of my organization and how we come up with threat assessment. So ITAC is responsible to evaluate the threat, and we do that according to a very detailed methodology. We look at the intent, the opportunities, and the capabilities of potential threat actors, and we do that.
Don't believe that these 30 church burnings posed a threat.
So if I may, sir, we do our assessment based on collected intelligence by other organizations. And so when we provide
so you have any
our
intelligence about the 30 church burnings?
Sir, I really think that I am not the best person to answer that question.
I just find it interesting because you do have extensive stuff in your public report about ideologically motivated extremism, religiously motivated extremism, politically motivated extremism, and yet 30 churches being burned down in Canada last year didn't merit a mention. I also note on page 30 of your report that says CSIS continues to engage with community leaders, members, and advocacy groups to offer support and solidarity and to reinforce the Government of Canada position that there is no place in Canada for racial prejudice, discrimination, and hate. Can you tell us if CSIS has ever reached out to show support and solidarity with the 30 church communities that were burned down in Canada in 2021?
I would defer to my CSIS colleague.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. What I will say is that the service is always extremely concerned with any violent form of extremist activity. In this case, that had already gone into the criminal realm, and so the RCMP may have further comments. What we are always doing is trying to get out ahead and see if we can determine where the threat is coming from in advance of those horrendous sorts of activities.
Of course,
absolutely, the burning.
But your report,
sorry,
your report does talk about a lot of things that happened in the past. So clearly, you're not just talking about the future. You have talked about terrorist attacks happening since 2014, ideologically motivated violent extremism. And yet, in 2021, there's not a single mention in your public report about 30 churches being burned down in this country.
Well, what we are trying to do is make sure that we understand the underlying threat so that we can try and prevent that sort of activity happening into the future. And we definitely are always very concerned about any serious acts of violence that can impact the national security of our country.
So can you tell me, yes or no, has CSIS reached out to show support and solidarity to the 30 church communities that had their churches burned down last year? Yes or no?
I can't speak to certain investigations that may be ongoing, but what I can do is say that we are definitely concerned with any acts of violence that impact the national security and could threaten Canadians.
Know if you've reached out to show support and solidarity?
I can't speak to what may be happening in the operational space in an unclassified environment.
Okay. Well, it would have been nice to have a statement of at least concern for these communities from CSIS. Considering the fact that at 4 a.m. in the morning in my town of Morinville, over 50 people had to be evacuated from their homes because a church was burned down, and there was a massive threat that a senior's home, apartments were going to be burned to the ground. It was only due to the heroism of 50 local volunteer firefighters that this blaze was brought under control. This could have been one of the highest potential mass casualty terrorist event on Canadian soil in our modern history, and yet it doesn't seem to have merited a single mention by our security services. So I want to put that on the record. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd. I now turn to Mr. Chang. Sir, you have a 6-minute block of questions. Whenever you're ready to begin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. My question is directed to the RCMP. I'd like to know what type of communication does the RCMP have with the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center and other threat assessment agency to ensure that threats of terrorism can be adequately addressed by law enforcement agency in Canada?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. We work very closely with Madame Chailly's team. We actually have a couple people embedded in ITAC to assist to bring the law enforcement perspective to better illustrate the overall threat when Madame Chailly is actually developing her and her team, her threat assessment products.
Thank you for that. And what measures can be taken to enable law enforcement agencies to act more proactively to prevent instances of violent extremism before they arise?
Thank you for the question. I'm a firm believer that it starts with prevention. We need a strong prevention outreach program, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, to get to the folks before they actually get into that world of violent extremists.
And have you had any success? Have you been having any success in that? And does our laws needs to be updated to ensure law enforcement have the proper tools to ensure safety of all Canadians?
I think when it comes to success, it's sometimes difficult to measure success when you're looking at outreach. The thing I would say, Mr. Sir, about the laws, obviously, you've probably heard through the committee, social media is a big platform of concern for us for these messages being spread and garnered additional membership to these causes. So that if there's legislation to be looked at, I'd say that around social media platforms, that's something that we should be looking at.
Thank you so much, Deputy Commissioner. Ms. Sopa, as the Director General of National Security Policy, what do you believe to be the areas we could improve in Canada to enhance our national security capability?
Well, I would begin with the significant effort we're placing on the prevention end of the spectrum, including work within our own Canada Centre. And I might ask that our expert, Robert Burley, speaks to the amount of work that's going on in the IMVE space. But I would say that between terrorism listings, the items that Mike Duhem had already referenced, the no-fly list, the SATA list, there are a number of tools that we can lever to begin to minimize the threat for Canadians, but also to work concertedly on the prevention end of the spectrum. I would say there is more to be done. There's a significant amount of strategic thinking occurring across all of our national security organizations to understand whether or not the framework that we have in place is adequate. We're keenly interested in some of the recommendations that are likely to come out of this committee to understand where we might place our resources and better impact outcomes in this space.
Thank you. And speaking about resources, do you think the threats that we are receiving in Canada, are they local threats, or would you think they're foreign actors involved in the IMVE threats for us?
My colleagues at both ITAC and within the RCMP and from CSIS would be better able to paint a picture of the type of actors we're speaking of. But I think what is most important to understand about IMVE is that it is a homegrown phenomenon. It's not a unique phenomenon to Canada by any stretch. It is transnational in nature, and many of these organizations have cross-border, trans-border relationships. But it is these are not threats being perpetuated from abroad. These are threats that are being fostered within our own society.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sopa. And my next question is directed towards CSIS. Could you give your perspective on some of the greatest terrorism threats facing Canada today, and what action can our government be taken at the federal level to address these threats?
Thank you for the question. Today, right now, we are faced with threats from all across the spectrum, and we look at what we term ideologically motivated violent extremism, which we're here to speak about today, as well as religiously motivated violent extremism. So in the service, we have moved a lot of our resources across over to look at IMVE. We see that as an increasing threat at the moment within Canada. As indicated by my colleague from Public Safety, this is a threat that is not only within Canada, but all of our allies around the world are experiencing the same rise of ideologically motivated violent extremists. The challenge with this particular, and I can't even call it a group because it is a variety of groups. It is across various different spheres. And so those are the two biggest threats on the terrorism side that we're facing these days.
Thank you very much. Now I would invite Ms. Michaud to begin her 6 minutes of questioning. Good to see you, Ms. Michaud. The floor is yours.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for their presence. Thank you, Mr. Duhem. You seem to be almost a tenant around here. Thank you very much for being so available. I was talking to Mr. Sauvé of the National Police Association. You probably know him. He was saying that one of the biggest issues for the RCMP is human resources. Quite clearly, there's a lack of officers in the field. He said it's all very nice to have the government put in new regulations or new policies, and that's what us members want, too. We want legislated frameworks. But when you don't have anybody to apply them or enforce them, you're no further advanced. So I was wondering whether that's an issue that you feel in your fight against IMVE. Do you also feel that lack of resources? I would say that throughout the organization, it's not unique to the RCMP either. Police forces throughout Canada have trouble recruiting. When it comes to the organization, COVID presented a problem. What's specific to my program, when it comes to IMVE, we prioritize different files. We work closely with CSIS to assess the threats that are coming. I can reassign resources. That's one of the beauties of my program. So yes, it's a temporary measure, but we do hire civilians as investigators now to fill the gap, and we'll catch up over time. But right now, that is indeed a challenge, and we mobilize different resources to deal with it. Thank you. He was also telling me that one of the causes for the lack of personnel is bad publicity that you've had in the last few years regarding the police force. Like any occupation, we face that problem. People fall into extremism, And that was publicized in the media a lot, that people in the Army or the RCMP were involved in the Freedom Convoy or other things. So we understand that didn't help your image, and it's too bad, but I think that's true for all the organizations. But when it's in an organization that's supposed to protect people, that is more compelling. We find this even more appalling. So we're wondering, did you take any specific internal measures to try to counter that and raise awareness of your members to ensure that anyone, even if acting in good faith, doesn't fall into extremism, doesn't get involved in that kind of movement? Were there any specific movements taken internally, to your knowledge? Ms. Michaud, I would say that the issue of identifying people internally starts with recruitment. That is, finding out whether people have the right character base to do police work. Throughout a police officer's career in the RCMP, there's the security rating that we renew every 10 years if it's secret. The challenge there is to identify people when they start to go toward different opinions that fall into that world. That's a challenge, capturing those people. We're aware of this, but unfortunately, people who retire are not people we can control at all. Sometimes people brag about their experience as a police officer to have a bit of a status symbol within those groups. So it's not a challenge unique to the police. I think that there were various federal government departments facing that same challenge of identifying such people. How do you do that before they become public servants and before they join those groups? Okay, thank you, Mr. Duen. I'd like to speak to the lady from CSIS. Apparently, according to the media, your office dedicated to the extreme right was closed in 2016. I think it's reopened now. That's part of my question. But I heard Mr. Vigneault, that is his name, I believe, who said that your service didn't have sufficient resources to effectively do surveillance of these threats. There may be technological advances, but can you tell us whether you've reopened that office, and why are you giving more attention to extreme right or ideological movements?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, we did back in, I think it was 2016, you're right, we did take down our investigation on well, at that time we were trimming right-wing extremism, and then after the attack at the mosque in Quebec, it really put again into the highlight the threat of what we have now termed ideologically motivated violent extremism, and the importance that we need to engage on this file in order to try and protect the safety of many Canadians. And often what we see in the IMVE realm is it goes against our marginalized communities and our minority communities and women, and we worry also about the impact on the LGBTQ community as well. So it really did
10 seconds, please.
cause us to relook and expand and reopen our investigation. And as I noted, and the director has noted, we have moved resources, about 50% of our CT resources have moved into that
Thank you very
sphere.
much. Mr. McGregor, over to you, sir, for your 6 minutes of questioning. The floor is yours whenever you want it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing today. You know, this is the last couple of days have been a very somber time for the NDP caucus. As our witnesses are probably very well aware, on Tuesday in Peterborough, our leader Jagmeet Singh had to wade through a group of people who were calling him a traitor. They were hurling expletives at him, saying that he hoped that he would die, and they were hounding him all the way to his waiting vehicle. This is the exact same kind of behavior that we saw littered throughout the occupation of Ottawa. And it's time for us to wake up to the fact that this kind of behavior has real physical manifestations and real threats. And I just want to know, I guess, from public safety and from CSIS, you did talk about the rise, and I'm glad to see that this issue is being taken quite seriously. But, with the rhetoric that we saw in Peterborough on Tuesday was the exact same kind of rhetoric that we saw throughout Ottawa and in the convoy in the lead up. I guess my question to you, to public safety, is, in the convoys and the rallies that we have seen, is there evidence that these have been used as recruiting tools to foster greater connection and cooperation between various IMVE groups?
I will begin, but I think the question is better placed with Cherie Henderson from the service on the data, what we understand about the threat. Certainly, we don't see the terrorism threat is indistinct from other broader societal issues going on. And we have been looking to Heritage Canada and the work that they have been doing in the online hate space and in the anti-racism space. And looking to those cues about how we can best work with those bigger policy issues, and they are important. As I indicated in my initial remarks, this is a whole of society question. There are certain preconditions that have given rise to in civil discourse and the type of treatment that
Can I just interject? Because this is not the first time it's happened to Mr. Singh. We had someone from an anti-Islamic group called Rise Canada interrupt him in 2017. There was a man named Brian Kidder who followed him down the street in September of 2020, threatening to arrest him. We just had this latest incident. I guess we have this growing evidence of the threat that exists out there. And how much longer do we have to wait before we actually treat this seriously and put in place the tools to prevent this? Because I'm really, really worried about the trajectory our country is headed in.
In relation to the protection of parliamentarians, I would perhaps like to turn the floor to the RCMP, because there is significant work happening in that space equally. So perhaps we'll start there.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. Just to your question, sir, the protective policing has, again, under my program, has a responsibility to protect members of parliament. We do have a minister liaison team that liaises with not only the ministers, but also with the leads of the official parties to discuss any ongoing security concerns. I did find out about this. We are following up on it. It's unacceptable. It's not the first time. I'm well aware of Kidder because it happened here in Ottawa, but we're following up on it to determine what can be done.
Thank you. We had a brief submitted by Dr. Stephanie Carvin, and she lamented the fact that there seems to be a general lack of interest from Parliament, and I don't think our politics actually reflects the level of concern that there should be about IMVE. She lamented the lack of interest in national security legislation. She identified the fact that Australia, for example, usually introduces legislation to update its national security laws every couple of years. By contrast, we do it about once every decade. I think as parliamentarians, we need to understand from the experts who we have before us today about what your agencies are missing, both in policy and in legislation. Maybe you could just take the next minute to inform us as parliamentarians the tools that you would like to see Parliament fully and responsibly discuss in order to allow your agencies to fully meet this threat and to keep Canadians safe.
Perhaps I can start. As you are all very well aware, the CSIS Act was created back in 1984, and the threat environment has changed dramatically since then. When the Act was created, there was no awareness of where technology would be today. And so the service definitely needs to have the tools, the technological tools that we can do to run really good investigations and get all the data that we need. But of course, at the same time, make sure that we're respecting the privacy and make sure we're operating in a clear legal environment, that we respect that rule of law in Canada. In another spot
10
where we
seconds,
could,
please.
another spot would be even the ability to share information beyond federal government. Under 19 of our Act, we can only
Thank
really
you.
share information.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, will now move to the next round of questions. To lead us off, I will invite Ms. Dancho for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. I did want to ask CSIS a few questions about some recent ransomware attacks in the United States, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, and sort of the threat level in Canada. I'm sure you're very aware of this, but the FBI was involved in the investigation there. It shut down a critical pipeline for several hours. 17 states and Washington, D.C. declared a state of emergency. And then, of course, this past February, we saw the attack on the Coastal GasLink pipeline in BC, millions of dollars of damage, the workers terrorized. It was unbelievable, the sites that we saw. Can you elaborate to the committee what investigation that you're doing in this regard? Is it on your radar? Are you concerned about attacks on our critical infrastructure in terms of pipelines?
Yes, we're very concerned about attacks on our critical infrastructure. As you can imagine, when a critical infrastructure attack happens, and I would even point you to an attack against a healthcare system and what happened in Newfoundland, how that impacts the lives of everyday Canadians on a very serious level. So we are definitely very concerned. We are totally alive to the issue around ransomware. Ransomware can be used both in a criminal element, but we also monitor to determine whether or not there are foreign interference or foreign states engaged in that ransomware attack because of the detriment that it can have. And so definitely we see what happened to the pipeline, and we want to ensure that there is no underlying foreign interference, but that we can try and help those critical infrastructure sites pre-pose themselves to or pre-protect themselves from that type of attack.
What work has been done to investigate the attackers on the Coastal GasLink pipeline?
Well, I can't go into specifics of what we do in an investigation just to ensure that we can protect our methods, but I can say that we certainly do look at these and we use all of our investigative powers.
Are you looking at the attackers on Coastal GasLink? Can you confirm that?
I can't go into specifics of an investigation.
Okay, maybe the RCMP can elaborate. Are you investigating the attacks? Has anyone been arrested?
So I can confirm that the matter is being investigated, but that would be in the provincial side because there's no element right now that would fall under the federal policing mandate.
Okay.
And as for arrests, Madame Dancho, I'd have to follow up because I'm not up to date on that file.
Can CSIS elaborate? Are you aware of anyone's been arrested?
That would not be under us. That would be with the local police of jurisdiction.
Oh, okay, so I'm just to be clear, you're acknowledging that this is a very serious threat. Of course, we know if GasLink pipelines were shut down in the middle of winter, people would literally freeze to death. In many cases, it's very one of the greatest threats I think facing our critical infrastructure is our ability to get these carbon-based fuels, these pipelines, making sure that they're protected. So what I'm hearing from you is that both the RCMP and CSIS are not aware if anyone's been arrested as a result of the BC Coastal GasLink pipeline. I find that a bit surprising that you wouldn't even be aware. You could not confirm or deny. It just doesn't seem that you're paying very close attention to it. Do you care to elaborate why you're not aware of whether someone's been arrested?
If that is directed at me,
Go ahead.
Sorry, if that was directed at me, as I mentioned, Madam Dancho, this falls in another wheelhouse. It's not under my program, but I'd be more than happy to follow up with
No,
it.
I appreciate that, but the CSIS just confirmed, of course, that this is a critical issue facing our country where we should all be very concerned if there are ransomware attacks or further attacks on our pipelines. And I'm not really being reassured that you can't even answer if you know if someone's been arrested. And this was a multi-million-dollar attack on a pipeline. We've seen ransomware attacks on a critical pipeline in the United States. So, CSIS, can you confirm that you're not aware if anyone's been arrested?
So what I would say is that I'm not familiar with the intricacies of what's happening in regards to the police investigation. What we are trying to do is make sure that we can get out there and we're aware of where the ransomware attack is coming from so we can try and help do some preventive activity and make sure that whatever we learn in those investigations can be shared amongst other critical infrastructure sites so that we can protect and help those protect themselves. But in regards to intricacies in an investigation, that's for the police of jurisdiction in a criminal case.
I appreciate that, but just as the official opposition, I think we would collectively urge you to ensure that you're paying much more close attention to these attacks, given what we've seen in the United States, given the importance of pipelines, particularly to fuel the nation, to keep us warm in the winter. I'm honestly quite shocked that neither the RCMP or CSIS are aware if someone's been arrested in the Coastal GasLink pipeline.
Thanks,
I am
Ms.
shocked.
Dancho. Thank you. I would now give the microphone over to Ms. Damoff, who has 5 minutes for her questions. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question is for CSIS. I wondered if you could just explain to the committee the difference between horrific crimes and when that moves into a national security threat.
That's a very good question, and thank you very much. When we are looking at, excuse me, under 2C of our Act, we're looking at any sort of individual who wants to engage in serious violent activity in order to pursue a specific objective, and that can be a political objective. And so when we are carefully monitoring, we're trying to determine whether or not that's already breached into a criminal. It's an activity that happened. It's to maybe just do a criminal activity versus trying to actually achieve a political change or some sort of policy change. So there's a slight differentiation there. And so when we do start to look at these sort of investigations, we work extremely closely with our RCMP partners to make sure that if it is moving in or it has already been in the criminal space, we leave it to them so that we are efficiently and effectively using our limited resources or our constrained resources, if I can say, to make sure that we are putting them on to try and attract or stop those future potential acts. So it is a bit of a balancing line, and we work very closely with our police partners just to make sure that we are all alive and in tune to what would be the criminal and what would be then into a terrorist attack in order to achieve a political objective.
Okay, thank you for that. My next question is actually following up on my colleague, Mr. McGregor's question about attacks on politicians as well as public officials. We've seen attacks on public health officers. Certainly, I know my colleague Michelle Rempel has talked about aggressive attacks on her. I've received threats, and the Prime Minister during the election campaign, and most recently, the just horrible attacks that the leader of the NDP experienced in Peterborough. Are there additional steps that the government should be taking to ensure that politicians are, and those in the public eye, are not being subjected to these kinds of threats? I recognize that there's work being done by Parliamentary Protective Services and the RCMP, but it seems like there are many times that it doesn't fall into criminal charges being laid, but it feels like it's a matter of time before this rhetoric and these kinds of aggressive anger turn into something more violent. Perhaps to the RCMP.
So thank you for the question. If I can bring you back to my last appearance before this committee, I'd shared with you some numbers that we looked at during the period of 2019 and 2020. And out of 273 files that met the criteria that we selected for IMV, there's 145 that never met the threshold. The other ones were investigated or passed on to police jurisdiction. It is a challenge with regards to meeting that threshold when we do have a file with regards to potential threats, be it online or by a phone or directly. We do engage with PPSC, Public Prosecution Service Canada, to discuss the file and see if we've met the threshold for these threats. It is a challenge. I can say from an RCMP's perspective, I did mention the minister liaison team is reaching out to all the ministers on a monthly basis, as well as the leaders of the opposition. And I know that the director of PPS, as well as Sergeant at Arms, is doing a lot of work on their front with regards to the members of Parliament.
Sorry to interrupt you because I only have a minute left, but what interaction do you have with the police of jurisdiction? So I know in Halton, when I called, they asked what I wanted to do, and I'm not an expert on policing, and that's not a unique experience. Down in Niagara Region, police refused to investigate an MP's constituency office that was vandalized. So what kind of liaison are you doing with local police services, and should there be more?
We, when there's a complaint or a situation of concern, we do liaise with the police of local jurisdiction. Usually it's through our INSETs, our national security teams, as well as we liaise with the Sergeant at Arms to make sure that he is aware of what's going on.
Okay, thank you.
I will now turn the floor over to Ms. Michaud for 2.5 minutes, to be followed by Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes, which will take us to the end of this panel. Ms. Michaud.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll continue with CSIS. There's another representative, Mr. Alweg, who came before the committee and talked to us notably about the cloud legislation that allows the CSIS to get better access to information from outside Canada. This is a U.S. law. We know that there's a lot of violence that starts online, among other places. Could you confirm that this could help you in your work if we were to adopt legislation similar to the Americans? Ms. Soper was saying earlier that we have to continue the dialogue internationally with our allies to see how we could counter the uprise in IMVE. So could this sort of legislation help you? What kind of change could it make at CSIS?
Yes, this sort of legislation could help us because it then allows us access to greater volumes of information. But what we would need to do is ensure that any sort of legislation on this front also respects the privacy of Canadians, because we want to ensure that any investigations we are doing are in rule of law of our land and respecting our democracy.
Et justement, sur ce sujet, peut-être.
Well, precisely, Ms. Soper, perhaps you could answer me. There's a bill that's being... Yes, go ahead.
So I believe our minister did announce that we've entered into negotiations in relation to the Cloud Act agreement. It would be a lengthy process. Two of our international partners, Australia and the UK, have also commenced negotiations and are nearing completion with the US. What a Cloud Act arrangement would do would be to put in place a mechanism that is as robust in terms of adherence to rule of law and civil liberties protections as the current mutual legal assistance arrangements, but would allow much more quick access to warranted access to communications, which are housed through communication service providers in the United States, such as your Googles, Facebooks, Apple, etc.
Thank you.
So it is a very important
Thank you very much.
mechanism.
Thank you. Mr. McGregor, over to you. You will take us to the end of this hour with 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly to Director General Soper, can you confirm, as the National Security Policy Director for Public Safety Canada, that it is right-wing extremism that is on the rise in the world today?
I hate to disappoint. It is not. I don't think I can state that clearly. I think what my colleagues in the intelligence world could explain more cogently is that there is a significant amount of individuals that are adhering to diverse sets of voices out in the world. They've galvanizing their discourse. It may be aligned towards what we would traditionally call right-wing extremism. It may be motivated by other factors, anti-mandate. It could be motivated by other societal factors. I think and Sherry can speak much more cogently to this question. But
I do want to get to the RCMP as well. The RCMP, you spoke about the training that's going on for RCMP officers with relation to IMVE. And I know there's a broader conversation about what the appropriate role of the RCMP should be, like with respect to community policing or a more specialized role. Could you maybe elaborate for our committee specifically what the training involves for the RCMP with IMVE? I'd just like you to expand on that point a little bit further for us, please.
Really quickly, considering time, there is a better understanding of what IMV is all about. How do we reach out? And this is not only within the RCMP. We want to join with the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police to have that same training for all law enforcement people across the country. And the fact that what are the key indicators that we can identify early on that would alert us, if you wish, to a possible IMV group or maybe person who's going towards that direction. The work is in progress, but it's not, like as I said, it's not limited to the RCMP. We want the whole law enforcement community across Canada trained in the same matter.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, that ends this panel. We will now take a very short break, but before we do that, I want to thank on your behalf the testimony that has been brought before this committee by these witnesses. You live these issues every day. You have brought your wisdom, your expertise, and your experience to this committee, and on their behalf, I thank you. Colleagues, I think it's going to be a very short turnaround. Clerk, are we just about ready, say in 2 minutes? A 2-minute break, and we'll be off to the second hour. And I call the meeting back to order. Very pleased that as an individual, we have this morning Mr. Richard B. Fadden and Mr. Vivek Krishnamurti, Samuelson Glushko Professor of Law from the University of Ottawa. They will each have 5 minutes to make their opening comments. Mr. Fadden, why don't I turn to you first, sir? The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to you on a topic that I think is of growing concern, but one which has been around for a while, which is something I think we sometimes forget. As you know, my knowledge today of IMVI is based on what I gleaned from the media, but I hope that my experience over the years will enable me to make a few useful points and to answer any questions that you might have. As I noted above, IMVI has been around for a while. Indeed, it was on our radar, although not with the priority it has today when I was at CSIS. The difference is that then there were far fewer people involved. In some ways, it was less intense, and it was less organized and less coordinated. To state the obvious, the better organization and coordination today are because of the Internet and its various manifestations. Also, those involved with IMVI clearly feel much more intensely about their concerns than was the case, I think, a couple of decades ago. This last point, the growth in intensity over the years, is the case in part because no one has really tried to get at the root of the causes of the dissatisfaction, which is the base of IMVI. I know that your order of reference does not specifically direct you to examine the causes of IMVI, but I would urge you not to ignore that aspect of the problem. Whatever preventative and legal measures are necessary to deal with the violence, I'm convinced that alone they will not be enough to stamp it out. Even if we succeed in doing so, it will not be the end of IMVI because, like most national security issues, it is not purely domestic in nature. Whatever the origins of IMVI, it always receives some ideas and moral support from abroad, if not sometimes funding and training. Unless we do a China and isolate Canada from the Internet, which is unthinkable, I do not see how we can stop ideas and support from abroad, which brings me back to my point about addressing the causes of IMVI as well as its kinetic effects. To deal with the violence, we will need control and punitive measures, but these must be built as narrowly and transparently as possible, or, without intending it, we will be promoting the further development of IMVI. This leads me to the question of who is best seated to deal with the root causes of IMVI. While they may have a role, in my view at any rate, it is certainly not CSIS or the RCMP or police more generally. Provinces, cities, and civil society will have to be involved. Perhaps the federal role should be developing a framework, coordinating, and perhaps providing some funding. So in summary, IMVI has been with us for a while and has deep roots. It goes to the effectiveness of our democracy. Violence is not acceptable, even if we must accept extreme views. Dealing with IMVI's root causes is an integral part of dealing with the problem, and this must involve more than the police and security agencies. Control and punitive measures are certainly necessary to suppress violence, but they must be narrowly targeted, lest we make things worse. Thank you. And I think for the first time before I've appeared before this committee, I've finished before my 5 minutes. Thank you.
Well, it gives me a chance to thank you not only for your testimony, but for your many years of distinguished public service to Canada, sir. Thank you. Now I would ask Mr. Krishnamurti to take the mic for up to 5 minutes for an opening comment. Sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It is a pleasure to be appearing before you today. My testimony will focus on how we should think of the role of different kinds of online platforms in facilitating IMVI and what we should do about it. To begin, I'd like to start with an analogy as to how we can think about online platforms. And the analogy, since I'm traveling internationally, is to an airport. An airport is a sort of a real-world platform that allows passengers like me to connect to airplanes going to many different places around the world. And we can think of online platforms in a similar way. online platforms are points of connection that connect people to different kinds of organizations or other individuals around the world for different purposes. Until now, the focus of legislative efforts in Canada has been around regulating platforms for expression, such as YouTube, Twitter, and the like. These are platforms that curate and distribute user-generated content. And I'm very honored to be on an expert panel appointed by Minister Rodriguez to think about the regulation of these kinds of platforms and the harms that they cause. But platforms come in many different stripes. And as we've seen with the Ottawa convoy protests, there's now a focus on crowdfunding. But this is not the only kind of online platform that is in need of regulation. There are many others that impact our daily lives as Canadians. We think about platforms for transportation, Uber and the like. Platforms that allow people, that enable the sharing economy, Airbnb, and so forth. There's many different kinds of these. So it seems to me that a useful approach for this committee and for the Parliament to consider in dealing with the kinds of harms that can be facilitated by platforms is to move beyond a focus on platforms that facilitate expression to those that facilitate various kinds of real-world impacts. Now, certainly, expression can have a tangible impact in the real world. It can incite violence, among other things. It can cause harms to people's dignity. But of course, the challenge in regulating platforms for expression is the constitutional protection of free expression in Canada under the Charter. By contrast, it is far easier for governments to regulate conduct on other kinds of platforms, precisely because of the nature of the activity that they facilitate. Economic exchange, the movement of goods, the sale of goods, accommodation, other sorts of services. So previous witness spoke about root causes, and certainly online platforms that permit the sharing of extremist content have an important role to play in reducing the flow of extremist ideas that lead to recruitment and the like. And there's an important role for governments working in international partnerships, because as the previous witness mentioned, this is a transnational problem. So certainly an important role there, an important interest to reconcile. But I would suggest that we also need to deal with the problem in public policy that we've provided other kinds of online platforms with a sort of digital exceptionalist exception from regulation. This is now being corrected with regard to crowdfunding through the extension of generally applicable rules that apply to other financial intermediaries that facilitate transactions in the brick and mortar world to crowdfunding sites. So this is a welcome development, and I would suggest that it would be a useful approach for Parliament to consider to extend other forms of regulation that applies, again, the bricks and mortar physical world to activities online, especially those that can be used to facilitate and incite online violence or violence in the real world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We'll now move to our opening round of questions. We may not get beyond an opening round of questions. It'll be close. And I'll start by inviting Ms. Dancho, who has 6 minutes for questions, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. And my questions will be for Mr. Fadden. Thank you for your service to our country. I'm very interested in what you said in your opening remarks, talking about the root causes of IMVE. Can you just give the committee, in perhaps a minute or less, just a few overviews of what you believe to be some of the causes? What drives people to extremism in this regard?
Thank you. I think fundamentally what drives people to this sort of thing is the sense that they are not being listened to. I mean, fundamentally, they come to the conclusion that the political structures that we have at various levels are ignoring them. We find their views sometimes distasteful, and they are driven over time to what we would call acts of desperation. But I think fundamentally our democratic institutions have not adapted to dealing effectively with people who have views that fall outside of the mainstream. And that is infuriating, and it drives people, I think, to violence.
Would you say that if the Prime Minister of the country obviously said, certain people have fringe, unacceptable views, he's called people misogynistic, do you think that that fuels any of that?
I don't think that attacking views is helpful by anybody, not by you, not by me, not by the Prime Minister. You can disagree with them. That's a different issue, but I think the Prime Minister went a little bit beyond that, and I don't think it was helpful. And it's the sort of thing that reinforces the sense that they're not being listened to. I actually disagree with most of the views that were being expressed in that general context, but that's neither here nor there. We need to find some means of dialoguing. Just like when I used to work, I used to argue that we have to find some means of dialoguing, for example, with the Taliban, because if you don't talk to them somehow, you ain't going to stop fighting them. So my argument is we cannot start a priori by arguing that they're wrong. You can argue they must not engage in violence. That's an entirely different issue, and I want to separate that very carefully. You pass that line, you become engaged in violence, and you got to do something about it. But we need to find some way of talking to them.
Certainly, and that was certainly the position that the Conservative Party took, that we need to not be pouring fuel on the fire because that only makes it worse. It sounds like you would be overall in agreement with that position, that we need to open up that dialogue. I'm also concerned, do you feel that sort of any government's exclusionary policies, for example, now not looking to debate the mandate specifically, but rather vaccine mandates, the impact they have on excluding those from society, do you think that that could drive people to extremism?
I think it can, but on the other hand, if we're going to live in society and live in a society that believes in the rule of law, if you take that view, you have to face the consequences. I don't think you should be ostracized for doing it, but if the law says you have to be vaccinated in circumstance X, Y, or Z, and you're not, and the law provides for penalty, then you have to deal with the penalties.
Certainly, it's important to maintain the rule of law and order in society, but I appreciate the word that you used, ostracized. We've had several different witnesses talk about those that are ostracized from society, lone wolves, those who feel isolated. So again, do you feel that that anything that isolates those from society, ostracizes those from public life, for example, again, not debating the necessity of that or the validity of that, but again, do you feel that that could drive those to extremism? When we see this, again, we could talk about radical Islamic extremism as well, and really any form of extremism, but in particular I'm asking about a side effect, you could say, of the vaccine mandates and their exclusionary impact on society in certain areas.
No, I think that ostracizing anybody is not helpful, and that can range from me ostracizing my son if I'm really disagreeing. I mean, you need to find a way to dialogue. But if I can just raise a point I made in my opening remarks, I think it's important to figure out who is best equipped to do the dialoguing. I don't think, on the basis of my experience, that the police and the and CSIS are particularly well equipped to do it. They have entirely different mandates to sort of try and prevent and to deal with actual crimes. But, it's sort of like, hi, I'm from the RCMP, I'm wearing a gun and I can arrest you. I'd like to dialogue on your views. It's not to be disrespectful of the RCMP, it's just not what they're paid to do, I would argue. Should they be involved in this in some way? I think so. But, it's a role for civil society generally. And as I was arguing, national security isn't national anymore. It's both international and subnational. So I would argue that the federal government sometimes, and this is not a partisan comment, I would apply it to both of the major parties, it's not a federal issue exclusively. And I think until we get our head around that fact, we're going to continue to have difficulties. We have to involve the provinces, municipalities, and also we do involve the international environment far more than we used to. But unless we do that and take advantage of opportunities to deal with civil society, and with even school boards, to start talking about these things early, we will end up having to use control and punitive measures to deal with the violence.
Thank you. Yes, and I would say again, just going back to the Prime Minister's remarks about calling those who didn't agree with them fringe, unacceptable views and misogynist. He is, frankly, the most powerful man in the country. He should be leading by example, and he really, regardless how you feel about it, it certainly sets the tone about how other authorities who report to him can act and what they can say. So again, I'll just throw the last few seconds back to you. Can you further elaborate on when you get that kind of power speaking in that way? What impact does that have on those being driven to extremism? extremism doubling down, for
I
example?
think it has a negative impact, but to prove that I'm nonpartisan and I've had that beaten out of me after 40 years of public service, I would say that certain members of Parliament who actively supported acts of lawfulness were not any more helpful.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I will turn to Mr. McKinnon for his 5 minutes of questioning. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Fadden, so again, I found your remarks interesting that we need to focus on the root causes of ideologically motivated extremism. And I believe you said that this was not a role for CSIS. Is that correct?
I think they have a role. I do not think they have the lead role. I think CSIS's job fundamentally is to collect information. That's the basis of the statute that created CSIS. Their job is to find information, analyze it, and pass it on to government generally to try and prevent problems. That does not preclude their trying to think about and dealing with the root causes, but I don't think, I mean, I can remember when I was director of CSIS, we had complaints when CSIS officers knocked on the door of people just asking them for information. They said they were being harassed. This was largely because of people who came to Canada from abroad. But you have to remember the mindset that a lot of people have about the CSIS and the RCMP is not entirely positive. It's not their fault, it's their job. So I think they have a role, but I don't think they should have the lead.
So you mentioned there should be a federal framework to address IMV. Can you imagine what that framework would look like and what kind of powers or roles it might have?
Well, first of all, I think it should be a national framework, not a federal one. So I think it's one that should be developed with provinces and others. It should, I think, try to identify the harm or the evil that we're trying to suppress. I was listening earlier on when your other witnesses before you, and I think there was some difficulty in answering your questions about what exactly becomes a national security issue, what's an old-fashioned crime, and what's in the middle. I think we need more of a dialogue about what exactly we're trying to suppress, and I think that's something that the federal government could lead on because it creates the criminal law. But on the other hand, the provinces implement it, through the police. I think it should involve probably roles for civil society, for universities, for organizations, and possibly provide some funding. I mean, that's a very general answer, and I don't mean to be unhelpful, but it just seems to me that limiting ourselves, by ourselves I mean the federal government, to suppressing IMV and trying to find out about it before we need to repress it is not enough. We need to think about it more holistically, more broadly, both conceptually and with other parties.
So do you see this framework as being, it's not enforcement oriented, it's more about communication, it's more about outreach oriented? Is that your view?
I would put it on a spectrum. At one end, they're sending somebody to a federal penitentiary. At the other end, it's somebody, I don't know who, it's maybe a municipal councillor talking to somebody who's really unhappy about the vaccine mandate that was mentioned earlier, and everything in the middle. And I think part of the challenge, and I admit it's a challenge, it's dealing with every point on the spectrum. And I would argue, and I think we made the same mistake, and I include myself in this, when we were dealing with terrorism. We concentrated too much on this end and not enough on the other end and what's in the middle. So I would argue we have to deal with every point on the spectrum and try and we have to accept that violence is unacceptable, period. So there is enforcement, there's prosecution, there's arrest. But the idea is to push it to this end of the spectrum to reduce the likelihood that the police will have something to do.
Is this framework kind of an adjunct to our police services and our intelligence services, something that gives them intelligence, or something that kind of steps in and I guess, steps into the community and does I don't know, various actions to...
I mean, I think it's the latter, because if it becomes known in an instant that this effort is going to feed the intelligence community, nobody's going to talk to them. I mean, I think that's just old-fashioned horse sense, if I can put it that way. So I think it's mostly people understanding that there's a possibility of a problem. The various and sundry people who were in the convoy in Ottawa, who participated across the country, it would be interesting to know if there's any mechanism today that would allow follow-up to talk to them. other than the police going to see if they can arrest them. Now, if they committed a crime, they should be arrested. But most of them didn't commit any particularly serious crime. But if we don't talk to these people, and I mean other than CSIS or the RCMP, they're going to continue to be annoyed, and we're going to have a problem over time. At least that's my submission.
So in our last panel, CSIS mentioned that the CSIS Act was created in 1984. It needs substantial upgrades in terms of IMVE. And I'm not sure that would conflict with your perspective here, or whether there's still room for those kinds of tools in keeping with your perspective here. And if so, what might those tools be in your view?
I was a bit of an unpopular person to some degree when I was still working, when people asked about whether or not we needed additional legislation, on a whole raft of issues. We may well on specific instances, I don't mean to close the door, but I think the larger problem is cultural. It's cultural within these organizations because people feel constrained either by history or baggage of one sort in not fully utilizing the powers they have. And there's also constraint because of all of you. Every time somebody asks for a power,
10 seconds,
we
please.
in Canada pile on accountability, control, and review, all to the good. But I would argue that Parliament didn't create the national security agencies to provide opportunities for review. They created them to promote the national security. And I sometimes wonder if we don't get the balance in this country, and I'm not directing this at any particular government, to be clear.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we always get that.
Thank you very much. Ms. Michaud, the floor goes to you for a 6-minute block of questions whenever you're ready.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for their presence. Thank you, Mr. Fadden. What you're saying is very interesting. I'd like to continue in this vein, same vein as Mr. McKinnon. You talked about a national framework. You said that the solution is not just at CSIS or the RCMP, but we have to involve members of civil society, academia, municipalities. Could you elaborate a bit on what the roles of these members of society would be? What role can we give them in the fight against IMVE, ideological extremism?
One of the challenges that we have in Canada in dealing with IMVE or terrorism or things of this nature is that aside from yourselves and a few of your colleagues, unless there's a crisis, we do not talk about it. We just don't. I mean, to be blunt, there are no votes for you in talking about national security unless there's a crisis. So there are a whole raft of other problems to be talked about and to be dealt with. So I think the first thing that these civil society could usefully do is talk openly about these things so that we don't think that everything has to take place under the color of darkness. Because when that happens, people very quickly find themselves driven to the end of the spectrum that I was talking about. So a lot of it is talking about it. A lot of it is having organization. I mean, I hope I'm not going to get myself in trouble today, but, I really do think that political correctness has reached the point today where it's almost impossible to have a conversation about a whole raft of issues. And if you're frustrated with government and with society to begin with, this is not helpful. So simply organizing and, if necessary, funding dialogue and conversation that could eventually work their way up to you and your colleagues with suggestions for change would be where I would start.
Mm-hmm.
I do greatly appreciate what you said. I see it in terms of prevention, too. I think that we see a lot of vulnerable people who are susceptible to being dragged into these kinds of movements. If we do reach them before they're dragged into that, we would have some prevention and have a discussion that could help quite clearly. All this starts online in our day. There's an increase in online violence. We're trying to legislate that. We said that's not the only thing. Legislation's not the only solution. I think we have to have an additional effort because that's the reality today. There are many things that go on in the virtual world that have negative effects in the real world. We see this with the Freedom Convoy. Certain things that were being said online were said in real life. So, in your opinion, how could we regulate or legislate about that without affecting freedom of speech? I think that's the big challenge. How do we strike that balance between the two, in your opinion?
Well, I think you put it very well, and it was what I was trying to say in my opening remarks. If you choose to regulate in this area, you should do so as precisely as possible, articulating very clearly the harm that you're trying to prevent, and do no more, and then talk about how you're doing it openly. This may be surprising for somebody who's worked in security for a good chunk of his career, but I would tend to do as little regulating of the internet and social media as we can actually get away with, because it is a dangerous path to go down. You know, today we're doing it for this narrow reason, and the next day we're doing it for something more broadly. I do think, on the other hand, that we can monitor more carefully what is on the social media, what's on the internet generally. Possibly we should find some way of not contradicting, but articulating opposing views than those that are set out and that promote violence and other things. That's a very difficult thing to ask of any government, but I wonder if it's worth thinking about, talking about. Maybe encourage universities to do it. I don't know, but I would go back to what you were saying. We should be very careful if we're going to start legislating what is or is not acceptable. If another country did this in Eastern Europe or in Asia, Canada would be the first country to condemn it. So we should be very careful not to go down this path unless it is absolutely clear that there's a harm that has to be suppressed, and there's no other way to do it. I used to have a friend who was the Deputy Minister of Justice, and he used to say he would block any initiative, legislative initiative, unless he was absolutely convinced there was a non-legislative way of doing it. I'm not sure we do that all the time now as much as we should.
That's interesting. Thank you. I remember that a few days or a few weeks ago, Elon Musk was buying Twitter, we find out. We had a committee, we asked questions about that because there was a fear. What is going to be done in the name of freedom of speech? What's going to be regulated with this new administration at the head of social media where a lot goes on? My political colleagues can tell you this is where we get a lot of negative comments with anonymous accounts, people who hide behind anonymity to send out things that are violent quite often. So, in your opinion, to your knowledge, let's say, are there countries that have legislated or regulated this?
I have to wait until Mr. Fadden comes back to talk to us again to hear the answer to that very good question. The last 6-minute slice of question time on this round, which will be the last round, goes to Mr. McGregor. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Fadden, for joining us. I very much agree with you. I think we need more dialogue in this country, and I've actually noticed an improvement in our politics since we started getting off of Zoom and interacting with each other in person. It's definitely helped to see our colleagues from all parties again. You know, what you were talking about, we had a very interesting witness last week, Mr. McAleer, who is a former white supremacist, has reformed himself, started a gang, an organization called Life After Hate, where he uses his personal knowledge of the white supremacy movement to reach out to people who are in that movement to help them get out. And you know, I was asking him about the challenge we have as policymakers, where on one hand we as the public want to denounce hateful ideology, but we want to try to reach out to an individual. And he was talking to us about how that can be extremely difficult, because when a person's identity and their ideology become intertwined, so they are one and the same. And so when you are denouncing the ideology, the identity feels attacked. Just following on Ms. Dancho's line of questioning, like it is important that we set a model of dialogue in our politics. But Mr. McAleer also said that while we never condemn, we also never concede. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that, because I think also there's a responsibility for our political leaders to not set an example that is encouraging that type of behavior. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on, on that approach, and if you can just further elaborate on those concepts.
It's a good question. I had not thought about that. It seems to me that it goes back to some degree, though, to what I was saying a moment ago, which is that, broadly speaking, these national security or serious crime issues are not things that we want to talk about, period, in this country. We just don't talk about them. I supported ministers over the years, and they would do virtually anything to avoid having to deal with the national security issue, because there's no win. You can't win in national security. It's just not possible. You're irritating somebody somewhere. So it seems to me that the beginnings of what you're talking about is talking about these things positively and negatively. And I don't know how that's going to be possible, because if you'll forgive me for saying so, the political environment in Parliament today is very, very partisan. And anybody who takes an initiative slightly off the beaten path is susceptible of being beaten about the head, if you'll forgive me for saying so. I'd argue, as somebody who's worked in this area for a long time, that national security should be an area where there's less partisanship. And we've seen this over the years come and go. But there's a risk in doing this. There's a real risk. And I think if you don't create sort of a bubble around people who are trying to do this, it ain't going to work. And if you can't do it, then who can is the next question, you political leaders. And I think there are other leaders in society who are susceptible of doing this. I continue to believe that the universities have a role in this sort of thing today, but as I was perhaps unwisely saying, political correctness is preventing much discussion now about some of these issues. So I'm not doing a very good job at answering your question, and I apologize, but it just seems to me that more discussion generally, with some protection for somebody who's willing to take a little bit of a risk, would be a good place to start.
And I want to follow on your comment about we should take as a starting position to avoid regulating the internet as much as possible. And I think that's a smart place to start from. But in identifying the harm, I took a visit at the website BitChute this morning. And there's all manner of, you just go down a rabbit hole when you look at some of the videos that are on there. And I guess the problem is that, a lot of what's in the internet is awful, but it's lawful. I guess the problem is when that stuff leads to something physical, when someone takes their cues from those videos and acts upon them. I guess my question is, we've had a lot of witnesses talk about deplatforming individuals, trying to cauterize the wound to isolate them. Do you take the view, is sunshine the best disinfectant to expose these people as much as possible, or is it best to try and isolate the people who are causing the most harm, as some of our witnesses have suggested, through the agency of deplatforming them?
I think the light of day is always the best place to start. I really do. But having said that, there are provisions in the law now that allow the government to go to the courts and to seek orders suppressing various platforms and whatnot. I don't think that's been used very much, and I think that to some degree is a cultural issue. It's a new way of doing things. It's a bit risky. Anybody or any minister who authorizes this is taking a risk that he'll be accused of really not protecting constitutional rights. So I would say the light of day, some dialogue, and if need be, suppress. But suppress as precisely as you possibly can.
Thank you. I'll concede there, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. That is all the time we have for this panel, which is too bad, because I'm sure we could have gone on for a very long time, and maybe there'll be other occasions when we can continue this very important conversation. So thank you to the witnesses for taking your expertise and putting it in such digestible form for the committee. Colleagues, we now take a very
Chair,
short
I have a point
break.
of order. I have a point of order, Chair.
Oh, a point of order?
Yeah. I've heard this testimony over the last two sessions today and last committee hearing And the term Islamic terrorism, Islamic extremism has been used, and I know that there's no bad faith, ill intent, and when people are using it. But we do have a term that is used now by government and by CSIS, which is religiously motivated violent extremism. And I'd ask that into the future that we do, although we are coming to a close on this particular topic, but that we do stick with that terminology. Thank you.
Fair enough. Thank you. We will now break for a very few minutes, and we will resume. Members who are connected through the Zoom platform, please use the in-camera link and in-camera Zoom password that was provided to you by the email. We'll take a very short break. We'll come back in camera in just a few minutes. Thank you.